Welcome, everyone, to the fourth episode of the Pulsatile podcast with my special guest, Mr. Phil Midland, a good friend for well over 30 years now, um, working in and out of various projects with him, but he was crucial for the development of Pulsatile International. And we're going to go over the history of that today and the period of time in which that happened. Just fair warning, Mr. Midland is a guy that lives in the future. He sees things 20 years out that other people don't see, and you can be you should pay attention to my advice to people is pay attention to what he has to say, especially about the East and about China. And we're very lucky to have him on the podcast today to share his insights. And he's been kind enough to go back over this history that we had with each other, and I think was a brave effort to try to push an East-West merger together, which is inevitable. It's happening right now. And Phil saw this many years ago, as did I, and we saw it from two different angles. So, Phil, I am going to start a slideshow, and it'll begin with a timeline, and I'll just bring that up.
Well, let me, for your colleagues, let me just say one correction of a word.
Okay.
Not merging, synchronization.
Synchronization. Thank you. Um, Wait a minute, I've got something up here that needs to go. There we go. All right, there it is. All right, now we should. All right, now let me bring up our images so that we can comment. I do not see yours. I had this problem last week. I apologize. Let's see if I can find a way to get you up here. Uh, all right. You're going to be invisible, Phil, until we get to the slideshow. I can't quite figure this out. All right. So this is a timeline of, whoops, Pulsatile International from its beginning. And the first three episodes focused on this era where I trained in Beijing and then brought it back and had a studio in Charlottesville, Virginia called Three Emperors. It was traditional Chinese with, some creativity on my part. And then uh, in 1998, I published a book and it attracted Phil, our guest. And there's Phil in his Navy outfit. He was a captain in the Navy. He was also the Naval Attaché to the U.S. Embassy in Beijing in the 80s, in the early 80s. And he left the year that I arrived. So we overlap in a very interesting way. He saw things sort of develop. He met the real players that caused the conditions that I walked into and experienced on a grassroots level. He saw it all kind of take shape from the top. So when you put our two points of view together, you get kind of an interesting view of things. So together we came up with this idea of Health Masters International, where we would fuse Eastern and Western approaches to medicine and health and try to insert it into particularly we were going to try to start in the United States because the United States was so wealthy and had all the resources, and China at that time was relatively underdeveloped, and nobody really wanted to have much to do with China. But Phil knew that China was going to rise, and I had the intuition that it would just based on my Qigong experience. Um, and then the rest is I'm going to get into in later podcasts and we're also going to get touch on how Health Masters International became Unified Fitness and then became Pulsatile International. So now we get into Phil's history, and I'm just going to let you take it from here. Here's a photo on the left to Phil, and could you just comment on this picture here, Phil? That's you.
Sure. The first one on as you look at it, the left-hand side
Yep.
would be then Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger.
Hmm.
And next, and on his um, uh, left, I guess it would be the Chief of Staff of the PLA. And on his right would be the Vice Chairman of the Military Commission at the time, Yang Shang-kun. So the picture highlights, and then the center picture as well, in the 1980s, a very special relationship between China and the U.S. was created and enacted on by President Reagan and Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping. So those two pictures capture that.
Right. So here's
And that was the time I was there, obviously.
okay. Here's you and there's Deng Xiaoping,
Correct.
and this is who's this just below you
The
here
U.S.
next?
ambassador to China at the time, Winston Lord.
Winston Lord, and is this
Mhm.
Lily back here? The very
Yes,
back,
Ambassador Jim Lilly. Yes. Mhm.
and he was the
Very much a
ambassador.
China expert.
He was the ambassador when I was there.
Later,
Lord,
later, he was the ambassador to China
yeah,
while you were there, actually.
yes. Well, I actually met him briefly while I was being chased out of the country. So could you say something about Yang Shang-kun? You've mentioned to me before that you thought he was kind of important um, in Tiananmen or pre-Tiananmen or just some,
Well,
perhaps
in
he was,
general, I don't want to point him out specifically, but at that time, and coming out of the revolution in the 30s and 40s, and then going into from the victory of the communists' uh, war and rebellion against the Kuomintang, clearly there were a group of leaders with a legacy of forming a communist state. And Yang Shang-kun, that general there, would have been amongst that small group of leaders coming out of the revolution. And now, in the execution of state governance, in this case in the 1980s. So now Mao Zedong is passed away. The Gang of Four is over, and Deng Xiaoping and Yang Shangkun and several others, about eight of them, were clearly in management and control of the country, and that group established a very special relationship with the United States and President Reagan.
okay. All right. And then here you are with the
That's the
guy that read,
defense minister, Zhang Aiping.
yes, and he was the defense minister under Mao and
No, 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 under
no,
Deng.
under Dong.
No, yeah.
But he served with Mao, right? He was part of that
Yeah, he was one of
group.
the generals in the revolution. Yes,
Yeah.
very, very much respected.
And he's important for a number of reasons to you, but for me, the segue is that he had a broken leg, I believe,
During the
and
Cultural Revolution.
in the Cultural Revolution, and he healed it using Qigong.
It was healed for him using Qigong practices and applications, yes.
Right. So he was a believer, and that takes us to the next slide. He introduced you to, well, we won't get there yet. I'll go ahead and fill them all out here. Let's take it one at a time. The purpose of this slide is to show that you didn't just sit in the embassy and fill out forms. You got your feet dirty. You went out, and particularly at this time, going to Tibet, that was like going to the moon. I mean,
Overland, because there was
overland.
no. Yeah.
So you
That's
drove.
where we're standing, and I through the arrangement of the defense minister, I had the PLA, the military, assisting my travel, and that's to me and to the Chinese military, people that were assigned to accompany me with one of the um, tallest points uh, on the road, and you can see it's 4,800 some meters. Uh, so, that's 17, 18,000 feet. That's higher than any point in the United States.
So you're talking about
And then the middle picture, yeah, what is it? 4,827
what? So
meters.
there's the elevation. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So the middle picture, this
And
is
again, traveling around, that's me in a tent. That lake is the lake at the top of the mountain that separates North Korea and China. So in the back, on the other side of the lake, is North Korea, and on the front, where I'm camping, is China, and just represents some. In this age, you're not allowed to go to these places, but we got around. Yes.
looks like it was pretty cold.
Oh, it was a normal day, probably in the 30s or something.
All right. And then here's where we go. So Zhang Aiping introduced you to this guy, correct?
And that is General Wu Shaozu, and he was introduced by the defense minister. At the time, he was the political commissar of the Commission of Science, Technology, and Industry for National Defense, which is the early days of what we would call the defense industrial base here. But General Wu, again, introduced to me by the defense minister, became a very important person that I had many interactions with in the context of our official developing relationship.
Okay. And then later he became Minister of Sport, which is where
That was in the 90s, yes.
in
Mhm.
the 90s, which is where Health Masters becomes relevant. All right. So that was,
I believe you'll show that picture later.
so let's see. Any other comment on these pictures before we move on?
No, this is all in 1980s, and I was very. In fact, I just discussed this today with somebody that deep knowledge, and we were talking about his son who's in China right now. He's 19 years old, goes to Columbia, and he's spending his summer in China, and he just can't believe how incredibly developed and automated overall China is, and he's been several places.
Hmm.
And then my friend said to me, you're lucky, meaning me, because you've seen the whole process over 45 years from coal fired steam engines for
Yeah.
railroads
Yep.
and donkey carts carrying cabbage to today. And yeah, that's true. That's what has happened in 45 years is historically incredible.
Certainly is. Especially if you rode the trains in the 80s. That was, which I did. I rode the
And you
trains
ride the
quite a bit.
trains now. I went to New York earlier this week, and just taking the train to New York is incredibly frustrating.
Yeah.
Uh, in China, it's not the case. It's very smooth, very fast, and efficient.
Well, and we were discussing Western attitudes, people who were living there at the time and how contemptuous they were of the Chinese. They're having the last laugh now. Um, all right, so let's move on here. All right, so when you come back to the U.S., if you'd comment, please, I'm going to highlight, expand these images one at a time.
Yeah.
So here you came back and you became an advisor to. Bill
Yeah,
Clinton.
this picture has nothing to do with China, but it has to do with my position at the time with the with NATO, and we were that's Secretary of Defense William Perry and President Clinton, and we were working a special operation at the time, and I was involved at that level,
NATO, you were chief exec to NATO, weren't you?
executive assistant to the
Executive
Supreme
assistant.
Commander. Yes. Mhm.
Yeah. So, but I kind of would like to go over you also, didn't you command the Seventh Fleet,
No, no, no.
in
I
the
was
Gulf
the
War?
chief of intelligence of the Seventh Fleet.
Okay. All right. And you've had a
Commander of the
number.
Seventh Fleet's a three-star admiral. That
Okay.
wasn't me.
All right. Um, but didn't you command an aircraft carrier at one point
No,
briefly?
I was an intelligence officer on an aircraft carrier.
Okay. All right. I don't want to misrepresent here. All right.
No,
So
don't represent that's not for sure.
so you were dealing with Clinton, and your impression of Clinton was that he was a really good talker. I think I remember you telling me
Very
that.
sharp, very smart. Mhm.
Yeah. Um, then, if I get the sequence right, and I want to blow this up a
So
little bit.
I'll just say in 1995, I decided with the rank of captain to retire from the U.S. Navy. And at that point, Mr. Andrew Marshall, who is the creator of the process of net assessment and the director of the Office of Net Assessment since 1972 in the Pentagon. And so this is a picture probably around 2017 or so. But Mr. Marshall asked me through contract to be an advisor directly to him about net assessment in China. So I did that from 1997 to 2017, so 20 years. And so Mr. Marshall is quite a historic figure, actually. But I had a very direct one-on-one uh, engagement with him for 20 years, from which I learned a lot about, especially the process of net assessment.
And correct me if I'm wrong, did he not introduce you to Samuel Huntington?
No, actually, the Navy sent me to Harvard, and I studied under Samuel Huntington.
Was that,
And Professor Huntington introduced me to Andy Marshall. So it's the other way around.
oh, so it's the other way around.
And that would have been in 1989.
Okay. So you had come back and then you went to Harvard and
From China, I went to Harvard. Yes.
then you went to Johns Hopkins for your
That was
for,
before. That was before that.
for international politics or something like that.
At the School of Advanced International Studies in
Yeah.
Hopkins, yes. Mhm. But that was before Harvard.
Okay. So just giving the audience an idea of how profoundly Phil, I won't say occupied is the best way of occupied a very an important position in the U.S. government, in the military, and in intel with respect to China. Now, where did Japan come into the picture? Because you're also an expert on Japan.
Um, well, again, that was during the Navy because I've lived in Japan twice while I was in the Navy. And through that, and then again, I was the chief of staff for intelligence at the Seventh Fleet, so I met very high level people within the Japanese establishment and government that led to very special relationships up to this day.
And
I go
I
to
just
Japan. I go to China and Japan 4 or 5 times a year. In fact, I'll be going there in a couple of weeks.
Well, just to comment, because we don't really have any slides up about Japan from what I've seen, and just talking to you, you have an immense knowledge of Japanese history, Japanese culture, and particularly of the the long-standing importance of the Japanese emperor to Japanese culture, and the contrast between that situation in Japan and what we have in China today. And you have emphasized to me that there is, I don't know, for lack of a better term, envy on the Chinese side. They covet that tradition that they lost and that the Japanese have maintained, even though they were incinerated, I mean, really defeated by us, they still held on to their ancient roots. Would you say that I don't know how to put that, whether it's a thorn
Well, this
in
goes back 1,500 years. This goes back 1,500 years when during the Tang Dynasty, the Japanese went and studied at the capital of the Tang Dynasty, which was called um, Chang'an and Chang'an, and which is now the city of Xi'an. But it was quite the academic melting pot at the time, and that included Japanese scholars who then took uh, concept of the Tao and Buddhism back to Japan.
so they
But then
extracted.
there are historical factors of that the separation after that, much of which had to do with the Mongolian invasion
Hmm.
uh, of China. Um, but and these are long historical discussions. But so there is a very deep understanding both ways of China and Japan, which is complicated to this day.
So just to put it crudely, the Mongol invasion essentially contaminated the purity of the Chinese system from the point of view of the Japanese. The Japanese left with the pure stuff, took it back, extracted this pure Taoist and Buddhist knowledge, took it back to Japan, where it remained untouched by the Mongols anyway. Um,
Basically said when you could come to that assessment. Yes.
okay. So anyway, this and under Mr. Marshall, you were tasked not only with bringing intel from China and understanding of
No,
China, which is,
let's not use the word intel. This is not intel. Net
or
assessment
I'm
is
sorry,
not intelligence. Net assessment is baseline understanding, the great majority of which is open source.
okay.
This is
So
not some intelligence operation. No,
so it involves
I
deep
just want to
study.
correct you on that because it's not.
Yeah, yeah,
Many
I
people make
understand.
that assumption. It's not correct.
I understand. So it's deep
No,
understanding, which is more learned and experiential than spooky 007 stuff. That's we're not
it's
talking about
absolutely
that.
not spooky stuff.
Yeah,
It's it's the senses: smell, see, feel, touch.
yeah. So that's one reason why you were drawn to my operation, but you were, I think, tasked, and I'm just switching over here in general with finding
Well,
out and talk.
this is of that time frame, and Alvin and Heidi Toffler, who lived out in LA at the time. I was encouraged to go out and talk to him because he himself was like an Andrew Marshall and Samuel Huntington, really looking at the future.
Yeah.
So
So
I think some of your viewers will know who Alvin and Heidi Toffler were and the books that they wrote. And I was encouraged, and we had a very, very good discussion. It went for about 5 hours about the family social environment within China.
And just so everybody knows, he's the author of Future Shock. That's his most
Yes.
famous
Yeah.
book,
Yeah.
which totally fits in with net assessment and trying to foresee the direction, at least of the future. Not exactly a specific future itself, but tendencies, uh, possibilities. Um, but in general, you were concerned with outliers, not so much conventional people, although I'm sure you did. That's part of net assessment. You had talked to the conventional people, but you also talked to the outcasts.
The
Um,
outliers. Mhm.
yeah, the outliers. And just sort of bring it. You sent me this picture, and I wanted to
Mhm.
emphasize it. That
This is a very, very complicated book about cosmology and the Tao. Okay. And I have met the author and discussed this book and the author with Andrew Marshall. Um, and it's what is interesting, but it doesn't make the case for the book. But what is interesting is this gentleman, Ma Baoshan, is the uh, um, brother-in-law
you kind of froze up there. Brother-in-law of Xi Jinping,
of
right?
Xi Jinping, as you have titled here. Yes. Mhm.
All right. Yeah, and this is something that's very much was part of my training, not so much in terms of scholarship and intellectual, but feeling.
Mhm.
And I think that, is the touch point that takes us directly from your history. And I would say that you have been driven further and further toward Taoism as
Well,
some,
let me just say the reason Andrew Marshall and I discussed this book and the author, and then I went and met with the author, and then talked again with Mr. Marshall. Um, this gets to the what is was very likely observed and understood by uh, Leibniz, Gottfried Leibniz,
Hmm,
in the right at the beginning of the 18th century, so early 1700s. Leibniz had developed a very deep understanding about China, but through mathematics. And that's why this struck my attention.
let's see. And we're talking about binary numbers that Leibniz was, by the way, is considered co-founder of calculus with Sir Isaac Newton. And Newton, the big competition was between the two. Newton won, and there's all kinds of legend about that perhaps Leibniz
And
was,
then Leibniz mysteriously passes away. But
yeah. And Leibniz did
talk about
find,
conspiracy theories.
yeah, we were talking about that earlier today. But Leibniz did find support with the Tsar, right? With Russia.
Leibniz's intent was to establish an academy of mathematics in St. Petersburg.
Yeah. Uh, Hardly anybody knows this. So the fact that all this
Well, something that
underpins,
your observers and readers, you can look it up and you can get a copy. But Leibniz wrote a very interesting short publication called The Discourse on China. And so if you really want to have a deeper understanding of that period and the from a mathematical approach and understanding of the East, I would encourage you to look at Leibniz's Discourse on China.
okay. And for me, the connection is that Leibniz studied the Bagua and he studied the I Ching, which is based on the Bagua, which is the eight-sided figure, which is a martial art, an internal martial art that is all historically connected to Qigong. And the guy in the previous episode, a young man who's a lawyer now up in Philadelphia, was showing me some 118-year-old Qigong master who practiced Bagua. And one of the interesting things about Bagua is it involves twisting. The body is twisted and turned, and the whole idea is to enliven the body, keep the chi flowing in the body. It sure worked for that guy, lived to 118. So my connection is just coming at it from almost a sport angle, but it's deeper than sport. It's not the way you would think of sport in the West. It's a feeling. You develop a sensibility that I think perhaps everyone is born with, but we lose it at a certain age, some more so than others. And these Qigong, at least the Qigong system that I was introduced to, um, kind of woke that up in me. All right, so you have any more to say on this before we move on?
No, I mean, we could say a lot on many things, but I think we should move on.
Okay. All right. We'll be here forever. All right. So, just historically, what happened is I published a book in 1997. It took 3 or 4 years for it to come out. It was accepted, and then it immediately became embroiled in a dispute between my original master and me. I came out the winner in that and got the book published. I got some local publicity, and that attracted Phil, who lived at that time, had moved to Charlottesville, and I believe your wife is the one that showed it. I got some
Mhm.
publicity in a local paper, and she said, "Hey, look at this." You came down to my studio. We began a conversation. There's a whole story behind this. I didn't know who Phil was. Of course, he didn't tell me who he was or his background or anything. He just said, "Huh, interesting book you got here." He goes, "What do you want to do with this?" And I said, "Well, I don't think it belongs in a studio. I think it belongs as a kind of wellness concept. It needs to be studied scientifically, and it needs to be rolled out as, perhaps corporate wellness, where you go in and teach businesses how to keep their employees fit and healthy, and so they can live longer and function better." And he went, "Huh." Phil goes, "Interesting. I'll get back to you." So again, I have some poetic license here, so not exactly what happened, but my memory is maybe a week later. At that time, we had dial-up. That's all we had for
AOL
internet.
dial-up.
Yeah.
AOL dial-up.
So AOL, yeah. Now I had at that time, I did not have AOL. I had a UVA email that I obtained somehow. I think it's because I taught at Parks and Rec. Not Parks and Rec, but their recreation program gave me an email. So you had that email, and so I turn on the dial up and I hear that screeching noise,
Ping
that we'd
pong.
hear. Yeah. And then this email comes up, and actually didn't register your name when you introduced yourself, and it went, "Hi, I'm in China. I just handed your book." My memory is to the Ministry of Health, and they're translating it now. And I was like, "Huh, who is this?" And then it dawned on me. I went, "Oh, it's that guy that came in, mysterious kind of guy." I said, "What's going on?" I don't even, because I didn't know what you did or what your function was. And then maybe several days later, I get another screeching, dial up in the morning. It's like they finished translating your book. They think that you are really authentic, and they're interested in possibly doing something with you. And, I lit up. Boy, I was like, wow, this is great. So at that point, Phil and I began working together to develop this business concept that we call Health Masters. And here's the logo. So we made Health Masters International Studio. And then, I had a crude business plan. I'd never even written a business plan before. And I think Phil gave me like a crash course and went, this is how you do a business plan. One, two, three. So I did one, worked it up, and attracted immediate investors based on the strength of the book. Um, and I had two medical doctors that jumped on board. Um, man, what's that? Let me get out of this. Um, hmm, can't get out of it. It's locked. Oh, I see why. It's because I expanded it. Sorry about that. Um, so two doctors jumped on board, two students who had some money that they wanted to invest, and between that group of people, I think we raised, something like $75,000, and we, launched this business, and it was very ambitious. And the first step was Phil took us to China. So I'm just going to run through these photos real quick. Um, we'll start with Phil took us to China in 1998. It was early January 1998. And we met with the Ministry of Health. This is the Minister of Health or Vice Minister of Health. I can't remember exactly.
Vice
who,
Minister.
and these we had translators with us, and this is Barry Mock, who was Phil's assistant at the time, great guy. Um, I think a guy that served under you in the military, that was his son. I think
No, he
that was the
didn't. No, no, he
relationship.
didn't.
And
His
Barry,
father, his father,
his
not him.
father, yeah. And
Yeah.
but I think Barry served too, though, didn't he? Didn't he
No,
have some
no.
military background? No? Okay.
Mm-mm.
All right. So then the next important meeting was with Minister Wushu, whom you saw earlier, and he is now the head of sport, the Minister of Sport. That's
At
Phil,
that
that's
time.
me at that time. And they had really gotten a hold of Qigong from the time when I was there. They had created essentially a kind of FDA-like approval system where they were accrediting Qigong systems. And at that time, I believe they had only 12 or 13 accredited systems. And so this is me and Wu. He's looking at my book. We had a great meeting with him. And then he introduced us to this guy. And this is Master Sun, who was one of the top people in a system of Qigong that at that time I think was the number one, the ministry considered number one. And it was called Zhineng Qigong, which means innate ability. That's the way I translate it. They translated it as intelligent Qigong, which sounded kind of silly to me. If you really look at the words, it means innate ability. So it means you're born with this sort of, and you get into Taoism. You ask a Taoist what human form represents the Tao most closely. It's a baby. So that's what they're referring to infancy, that you have this primordial ability when you're an infant. So we had dinner with him, and I just wanted to bring attention to this fellow sitting here. There's Master Sun, there's Phil, there's me, there's Barry, and then this guy, is this Lao Wong?
Yes, Lao Wang. Mhm.
So he was our translator. He did a lot of work. He was a great guy,
And a
um,
practitioner of Qigong.
a practitioner, and he had some sort of, I
Mhm.
remember you telling me he had a box that he
Yes.
used. Like he had um, what would
Like
you call it?
you know, and you've worked with like a ticking,
Like a
a
talisman of
time.
some,
Yeah.
and it contains special chi. And the interesting thing about objects being able to retain chi is something that I'm interested in right now. Something I used to scoff at, I no longer do. But anyway, he was very helpful. And this is the group meeting with the heads of the leadership of Chaoyang Hospital, and and then this is us meeting with. Let me get me out of the way here. This is the Beijing University of Traditional Chinese Medicine, and this is one of the doctors. He's going to be a guest on the show a little bit later on, several weeks from now. But he was a real firebrand. Uh, he gave a 3 hour lecture that put the Chinese to sleep on homeopathy. And all of us were exhausted. The translators were exhausted when we finished. But he had tremendous energy. He was very excited, and he has never forgotten this. And wants to have lunch sometime, Phil, if we can arrange that.
Sure.
I told him you'd be willing to do it. Um, so let's see. Let's move on here. So this was amazing. I'd never seen anything like this, and at this point, I'm thinking, who is this guy? Yeah, that could make these introductions. I knew he was the attaché at the embassy, but you know, I knew people at the embassy, and that nobody had this kind of reach into China and this kind of respect. You could see the respect that all these people had for him. Um, so now, what came out of this for me and for Pulsatile, what is now Pulsatile, was this meeting with I'm sorry, Minister Wu, and then Master Sun, and that led to Health Masters back in the States. So once we returned to the States, Phil set up an arrangement with, and I'm going to blow this up. because I think it's worth looking at. This group right here, this is Sinopharm. Sinopharm was the manufacturer, essentially the industry controller of all pharmaceuticals, including traditional
Eastern and Western. Yes.
East and Western. And they were a really impressive people, and kind and good. And we introduced them to UVA, and I felt really bad just by the way UVA behaved. UVA folded their arms and acted like, "What are you up to?" You know, because at this point in time, China was kind of a pariah because of Tiananmen Square. Falun Gong had not happened yet, but there was a lot of bitterness over Tiananmen Square and just in general jingoism against China. You know, I think Samuel Huntington pointed this out that the West just doesn't get the East at all, and I never seen a better example of that than the way UVA reacted. They came saying like, "Hey, we can bring all of our stuff. We can bring traditional medicine here and work with you." And then UVA immediately said, "Well, you know, we have a 250-year-old tradition of Jeffersonianism here to protect. What makes you think that we're going to, you know, share our brand with you?" And they said, "First of all, we don't really care about traditional medicine. We want access to your rarest herbs so that we can extract compounds for making medicines." And then the Sinopharm people politely replied, "That's not how we do it. You know, we don't extract individual molecules from this stuff. We could do that, but, you know, we go by traditional Chinese medicine, which is concocting, mixing these herbs in a very sophisticated way." And it just, you know, it landed flat. So we just moved on, and we brought this guy in, and this is Master Xu, who at that time was the deputy director of the Beijing Wushu Institute. He was one of the all-time grandmasters at that time of several different forms of martial art, many of which were fascinating to me. But Tai Chi, they were really into promoting Tai Chi because they knew its relationship to Qigong. And he was also a Qigong master. And he had a tremendous following in Japan. And he was the scary guy. He was he wasn't to me. He was actually very nice to me. Um, but boy, to the students in my school, he was hard. He was hardcore. And he was also incredibly nationalistic. And you could tell deep down inside he was nervous about being in a non-communist environment and mistrusted a lot of what was going on. But I learned a tremendous amount from him. And I think Phil, one day he sat us down in our office at that time, which was over my studio, and he gave us a lecture on what Qigong is. And what I go back to that now. And he said that what Qigong does is it allows a human to collect the background energy that was created with the Big Bang. And I immediately kind of blew that off as just like, okay, the Chinese are like grab bagging stuff from they've gotten from Western scientists. But now I'm thinking, I think the guy was onto something. He was, you know, that gets us, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but that gets into torsion energy. But he gave an entire lecture on that. He explained Qigong to me in a way that took me to another level and allowed me to talk about it in a more sophisticated way. Plus, I learned a tremendous amount about martial art from him. And we took him to meet this guy, George Beller, who was married to Katie Couric's sister, who at that time was a state senator. She had died of tragically pancreatic cancer. But I knew Dr. Beller. I met Dr. Beller because when the book published, you know, suddenly rich people decided I was worth taking a look at, and a wealthy woman who went to the same country club as him studied with me and then went to him and said, "You need to talk to this guy." Beller came over and had a private meeting with, I think you were in with you, Phil, and me, and he then tasked his business guy to work with us, a guy that completely failed. Um, but Beller seemed very sincere. He wanted to work with us. I took Shu over to meet him. They did a ultrasound on Shu's heart, and Shu was 50 years old at the time. He was a smoker and a drinker, and they said that his heart was like that of a 30-year-old, which I thought was kind of interesting. But at any rate, things went nowhere with Beller. And it really had to do with the internet boom at that time. And the guy's name was Kernahan, got involved in business ventures involving internet businesses that all of which went down in flames in the dot-com bubble. And it was another kind of, again, we were too early. We were early, but we were right. So Shu went back. We couldn't even get the local newspaper to give us the attention that we needed until like a few days before Shu was supposed to leave. They showed up and did an article on him, and that helped. That grew the school a little bit. And nonetheless, we doubled down and we brought Minister Wu rather, sent us another grandmaster. Actually, he was just a professor at this time. And this is Liu Xiaojun, who now is the head honcho of all of Taiji in China. And he was a rising star at the time, and we brought him over. Again, he taught a great deal, and he and I became really good friends. And to this day, we're good friends. And I have here, let's see if I can get the right angle on the camera. This is an insignia that he came up with for an association called the International Society of Chinese Health Practices that he's created over in China. He has an annual conference. Phil and I have been to a couple of them. I've been to three or four.
I
Phil's
was
been
just
to
there
two.
last year at the conference.
Yep, you were there. And so he's thriving and he's in charge of putting up 30,000 Tai Chi centers. And again, they've adopted the 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 term Tai Chi instead of Taiji. Taiji Chan, I went around berating people for years saying, no, it's not Tai Chi, it's Taiji. Taiji Chan, and really emphasized that. And then the Chinese flipped it. Now they're going Tai Chi. So they're doing it as a way to catch, more flies with honey. Okay, you want to call it Tai Chi? Fine. We'll call it Tai Chi, and they can internationalize it all the better. Um, but anyway, these 30,000 centers are going up all over China, and Phil and I both think that they're probably up to something with that eventually is going to involve Qigong. But right now, it's just Tai Chi, heavily promoted. You can see on Facebook now these random videos by the movie star Jet Li. Li Linjie, for those of you who know his Chinese name, is promoting Lu's five-step Tai Chi form, very simple Tai Chi form that they're trying to get all of China to do. We were there on the very. We not only were there, well, in some ways, I think we could say we inspired it, that our interaction with them, because what I was doing was trying to simplify a great deal of what is involved with Chinese traditional movement, health practices, and so on. And they just looked at that and they went one better. They did what they tend to do. Um, so the, ultimately, Health Masters did not work out, but it gave me what I needed. And I remember talking to Phil about this. I was pretty despondent. And I said, we're never going to get these Western people to accept this on Chinese terms. We're going to have to come up with a way to talk about it in Western terms, or they're just not going to listen. And I think Phil's response was, well, good luck with that. I mean, who's going to pay you to do that? So I got to work on the second book, um, and I'll blow it up here in a second. The second book got the door open because I presented a plausible medical theory, and I went over and had face-to-face sit down as I created the manuscript for this book. I would sit down with the head of immunology, with the head of neurology, and so on, and ask them questions. what part of the body would be involved, if this happened and so on, and then put together this theory that they were all kind of looking at that time and scratching their heads over and going like, this deep part of neuro autonomic physiology appears to be central to everything involved with health and sickness, but we don't really understand it. So I came out with the argument saying that, well, it's an organ system that can be regulated and it has a sensory capacity that this practice exposes. And I rebranded the word Qigong. The word Qi was sort of a no-go for Westerners. They just would turn them off right away. So I call it reflective exercise based on physics, the idea of reflection. Like when you shoot a radar beam at something, it reflects off the object and back to the receiver, and you get intel, you get information, you get data based on that. And so the idea was that your body is producing a signal that your hands initially can pick up in the surrounding air. And then from that, you can follow that signal back inside to its source. And when you do, it activates this sensory dimension of the autonomic nervous system. That's the essence of this theory. That got me into UVA, and I sold this to the swim team. I went to them and I said, I bet you guys get sick a lot. And they said, yes, we do. The coaches did. And they said, I tell you what, you teach the coaches. And if the coaches feel like there's something to this, we'll let you teach the team. I did. The coaches loved it. I taught it to the team. They went back and told the sports physician for the entire athletic department what was going on, that they could cure strep throat, colds, respiratory infections, even physical injuries at will. That startled that doctor, and he came. I was sort of dragged before a tribunal of the athletic department, and they were like, "What are you doing? You did this without our permission." And I basically said, "Mea culpa. I want to work with you. I'm sorry to have offended you." And they said, "Fine." And they let me go ahead, and then they assigned researchers to do a research project on the swimmers since I'd already gotten underway, and the project produced a really positive study. So what we found is that people that learned the reflective exercise routine that I'd come up with, if they just practiced at once they learned it, if they just practiced once or more a week, they were 75% less likely to develop respiratory infections, which was the bane of the swim team. That's what stopped them from performing well at their best level, was respiratory infection. So now I'm just going to blow the rest of these up here and then move on them one by one here. But the key was the publication of this book, then the swim study, and then I took it to Phil. And Phil immediately, I don't know who he took it to first, but I got an audience with the of Defense, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs, his
I
staff.
took it to Andrew Marshall, so I took it to, and he made
Oh,
the introduction.
all right, so Mr. Marshall pressed and got us in to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs. They were very positive and they said, you need to do another study. And so then we then went to the War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And I remember Phil and I getting up at the crack of dawn and driving through the snow and ice to get there. And when we presented, it was well received there too. But then afterwards, the head of research, this guy that looked more like he was a master sergeant than he did colonel, but he looked like a very military guy. He just said, "Well, you need to do more research on this." And then Phil, in very kind of you know, Phil had just been sitting there the whole time. He goes like, "Well, we're hoping that's where you fit in." And then the guy looks at Phil and he goes, "Who are you, sir?" And the guy goes, and Phil goes, "I'm here at the direction of Andrew Marshall." And the room went dead silent. And the guy froze with his sort of 10,000 mile stare. And he goes, "Are you saying that Director Marshall is I forget that he used a military term, tasking us. That was the term, tasking us with doing this research. And you said, no, I just think it's something you ought to consider. And he went, oh, yeah, well, we'll consider it. And then there was a lot of blah, blah, blah. And I sent emails and proposals around for a couple of years, and nothing ever came of it because that's just the nature of bureaucracy everywhere, as I found out as I moved deeper into this. Not just in the government and in the military, universities are the same way. You've got to have a key inside player on your side, or you're going nowhere because the other pigs at the trough are just going to hog you out and block you from getting in. So the next step was I wrote up a proposal for a joint operation between the U.S. military and the Chinese military, where the Chinese would pick a Qigong system that they thought was effective, teach it to a cohort of their people, have a control group and an experimental group, and then um, see what difference there was over a course of time, the ones that practiced versus the one that didn't. And then I would teach two cohorts here, control experiment, control uncontrol, and see which one was better. And from that, we would develop a system or a practice that was uniform, that could be scaled and taught, um, not necessarily globally, but to as many people as possible. And this is an approach that I've called the supercell theory, which is that if you seed a human population with individuals at about a 1 to 6 ratio, and they have to occupy the same geographical space, that you would enhance just on the basis of energetics. You would enhance the wellness of that community by having that 1 out of 6 person operating at that extremely effective pulsatile level, and that would transmit automatically to others. And this is kind of what the Chinese are up to, I think, with the 30,000 Tai Chi Center. So again, they took the idea and were able to be successful with it. Now, what I have here is that you can see this. So I had these things that I call 6 stressors, and I'm trying to recall what they were. It was environmental pollution, um, disease, and population are the three sort of negative things, and then you have cultural chaos. Um, I'm sort of gelling on the other two. Economic development was another one, and then there's 6 of them. And the idea was that you need to balance those 6 stressors, and the way to do that is with this what I called RE, reflective exercise, Western mind body acupuncture meridian qigong. So that would be the system that would come out of this east-west relationship. You would then create a seawall, as it were, of human beings that would be, when they were hit by these stressors, which would include pathogenic disease, it would wash through them and it would evolve. It would force the infection to evolve. This is essentially what a vaccine is supposed to do. It would force it to evolve in a benign direction, and then that would redound to populations. It was kind of a wild and ambitious idea, but Phil got it in front of Rumsfeld. And Rumsfeld, I believe his comment was, "Oh, that's interesting," and then we never heard anything back from him. So, however, what the, the the final, and I think this is the most important thing that happened out of this book publication, was that oops, sorry, go back to blow this up here. We were able to, I was able to attract the attention of this fellow right here, Dr. Tyven Rich, who is one of the lead cancer researchers and cancer clinicians at UVA Medical. And Tyven is a very interesting guy. I think probably was an old hippie at some point. So he had a tendency to just not dismiss things because they seemed weird. UVA already fancied itself as being forward looking. They were using yoga and things like that as forms of therapy. So when Tyven got a hold of my book, he was like, "Okay, I want to try some use this as a complementary therapy." He and I did some work together with small population of people. He gave me a couple of patients. One woman reduced her lethal cancer, her tumor site, shrunk it significantly. So it was enough to get Tyven's attention. And then I took Tyven to Phil, and then Phil sponsored, again, this is HMI 2, sponsored a trip, a 10-day trip with me and Tyven and going back and revisiting many of the places that we tried to interact with back in the late 90s. However, this was another step function higher. You could see that China had developed quite a bit. They had shut down Wushu had basically been shut down and exiled because of the Falun Gong debacle. They had a stranglehold on Qigong. There are only five legit systems. This is the new reformed Qigong society here. And there's Lou. He was right in the middle of it. And it was based on very much on the Western model. It was a feel-good approach to Qigong. Instead of feeling these extraordinary things that I was taught to feel, it was you got to be happy. The emphasis was on being happy. And if you did anything that made you unhappy, such as disgruntled or unhappy with the government, then that was bad Qigong. You don't get in. It had to be positive. And however, when Tyven and I went out among the population, we went to Tiantan, Heaven Temple, and a lot of people practice out there in these various parks that they have around here. Tenton's the biggest one. I saw people doing old school martial art and qigong, and I went over and asked them. I said, "Are you feeling?" And I used traditional Chinese terms, and they were like, "Yeah," but they did it privately, and nobody messed with them. But if you got out there and stood on a street corner and started trying to create a school with a large following, like Falun Gong had done, you got shut down. So at that time, this is 2007, and this is pre-Olympics. So China was feeling its oats then. It was on the move. And Tyven, we tried as hard as we could. Tyven presented to 301 Hospital and some very important people. Um, Tyven also,
You should add that 301 hospital is the Bethesda of China. It's the military,
yes,
key
and
military hospital.
and the best. I mean, the very best um, practitioners of traditional and conventional medicine, Western medicine, work there on the leadership. And Tyven presented to them. I presented to them. We made contact with a couple of the leaders in 301, and Tyven ended up bringing them to UVA. And once again, we ran into this, I don't, the lethargy of that institution, proving that it isn't just the military, it is large institutions. And Tyven was an insider, and he still couldn't get them to budge. And they didn't want to spend the money. They had their own quote unquote contacts in China that they wanted to work with, and they didn't accomplish anything as far as I can tell. But what Tyven did for me was that he raised some startup funds. I funded the rest of it um, to create a DVD. And this is where we started thinking like, okay, and Phil had made this point to me many years ago. He said, you got to stop thinking of yourself as hardware. You need to be software, meaning you got to have a method that can scale. So with a DVD, I can scale that and pass it around and then people that want um, deeper understanding can sign up for private lessons. That was sort of the business side of it. But Tyvid wanted to see if it would work as a cancer therapy. So he invested, the cancer department at UVA is the richest department in the entire medical school. So they have tons of money lying around. He gathered some of those funds for research purposes, so it was all legit, and essentially allowed me to create this DVD, which ended up helping me later on. Um, so then the big breakthrough was that I kept telling Tyven that this is cardiovascular, this practice. And so he went, all right. So he used his influence to get us an audience with people in cardiology, who then steered us to people who created a device for picking up, interestingly, something that they call reflections, which are shock waves that are sent around inside the body because of the cardiovascular system. And using this sensor, they're able to capture the shock wave, interpolate it through integral calculus, and get all kinds of important cardiovascular measurements that are gold standard level. And that includes blood pressure, diastolic and systolic blood pressure, and heartbeat. The big one is called interbeat interval heartbeats. So what they do with that is they measure the rests in between each beat. And the more rests you have in between each beat, that indicates that the parasympathetic nervous system has been activated. That's the relaxation, the wellness, so to speak, side of your autonomic nervous system. The other side, the sympathetic side, is flight or fight, and it's all that side is also associated with inflammation and fighting disease. The parasympathetic is associated with recovery, which is an basically it's a yin yang kind of operation. So when you get infected, you have an inflammatory phase where your immune system tries to corrode or burn to death whatever it is that it's dealing with. If it's a pathogen, it's going to be that. The pathogen fights back, the immune system fights back, and you have essentially a flamethrower war. Now, once the immune system burns itself out or subdues the pathogen to a certain level where it can control it, then the cooling off aspect of the immune system is activated, where you have phagocytes that come along and clean up the debris, and that's associated with this inner beat, this pause between beats. So they hooked me up to this monitor. They had me do my magic. You can see these lines right here. That was when they said go. So there's like this is a baseline, and I said go, and then you immediately see an elevation right here. You can see a sharp elevation in the beginning. I don't think it'll get any bigger. Um, and then it's above baseline and it stays there. And they're like, well, how did he do that? And then when they said stop, boom, it drops. The interbeat intervals likewise increased. So that intrigued them enough to where they went, okay, let's do some experiments. Let's get some people who do yoga. Let's get some people who do my thing, and let's do a comparison. They did that study and they found immense differences, and that all but one of my students could do this, what I'm showing right here. Whereas the yoga people they had nothing. So that was something I was really proud of, and that led to two experiments that eventually got published along with the swim paper. So that brings us to a fourth study that was done simultaneously with the two cardiovascular experiments, where we tried to see what sort of effect reflective exercise would have on brain trauma, and it was a smashing success. We had six veterans that had traumatic brain injury. And this is where I really saw how protected people are by the medical system from some opportunist who wants to come in and sell snake oil. I mean, it was so hard to get to these people, and we had to move heaven and earth. And I mean, I could tell a few stories here, but I won't waste time. It was kind of funny to observe it. We had to drop one veteran who was too crazy to do it. But then the five that stuck with it, all of them were able to manage their crippling traumatic brain injury symptoms, which included crippling migraine headaches, inability to sleep, PTSD, startle stuff. They were all able to manage it by feeling what I was now calling, actually, I didn't have a name for it. I just called it the pulse. And then I would use traditional, I call it the neurovascular pathway. I had these um, kind of verbose terms that I use, but I was moving toward an expression that I use now in pulsatile. But the real breakthrough came, these studies then came to the attention of a software engineer who's a graduate from UVA, and he invited me to come out to Google and give a talk. Let's see. No, I want to get back to that. He invited me to give a talk at Google, and this was, you can see the date there, 2014, March, and it was on reflective exercise. I went out, I gave a 2 hour lecture on it with, you can still see it. It's up on my website. It's also up on YouTube in general. And it was pretty successful, and I was able to get enough attention um, that it knocked me up to another level. And it also, I learned quite a bit about how digital technology was being applied to health and health management. And so Google became very interested in what I was doing. They were interested in the device that we use to measure the reflections. And one of Peter Thiel's partners from PayPal, who had joined him in, they shut PayPal down at this point and they were doing Founders Fund, heard about this lecture and then invited me to come hang with him. And actually, he just texted me about 2 weeks ago. I taught him and a group of his Founders Fund friends. I taught them for about 10 days, and at one point was thinking about the possibility of getting funded by them, but there were too many problems. It would have involved me moving out there. My wife was 8.5 months pregnant, so I decided to pass on that. Didn't really go down that road, but it did lead me to into pulsatile. And in 2016, I published the book, Autonomic Intelligence. I had a new vocabulary for talking about it that was grounded in pure science. I connected it to all the other forms of mind-body exercise and even pure exercise and talking about the health effects in terms of the autonomic nervous system. So it gives people a vocabulary for understanding the physiology of your own health. And then if you want to learn, you can go up to this higher level, which I call, that's where you discover the pulsatile self through what I now call the reflective response, which is a pulsing sensation that begins in the lower abdomen and then rises up to the forehead with your breath and then down again. And it's significant in that it starts in the lower abdomen around the navel area or just below it, because when you are in utero, that's where your heart is. The actual heart is located in the lower abdomen, and then it moves up into the chest as the fetus grows and matures. So, Pulsatile came out, then I was sort of playing footsie with Silicon Valley for funding, and then COVID hit. And I pivoted away from the idea of contact devices and went with a couple of my students from the past had gotten into electrical engineering program at UVA, and they got involved in radar technology, radio frequency technology that you know, they were in the military, so they were looking at it from a military perspective, and they saw that it was being used for health and reading so-called vital signs, which includes the heart. So they were like, would you like to work with us? Because we can make this whole contact device stuff obsolete. And I was like, yeah. So I came up with this concept right here where you can, from about 10 feet away, pick up the reflective response as well as other biomarkers that could indicate whether or not you're sick. And then COVID hit. And when COVID hit, they were like, oh, this will be over in 2 weeks. And I said, no, it won't. I said, this is going to change the world. And we got into a big fight. And so I took my ball and left. And I went off with this idea and kind of pushed it for a while and then finally decided, you know what? What I have, the gizmo that I have right now, which is a software app, I call it the RFR app. It's sold in Google Play. You can put it on your phone. You can pick up a signal just fine using that to verify if you need verification that you are feeling what you think, what I'm trying to say that you're feeling. And there's a whole bunch of data to support that it's a good thing, this particular marker. So what's the point? Um, the whole point would be to get investment, to scale, to go global, and I just backed away from that and kind of, I'm not haven't backed away from it completely, but what really happened is that Phil introduced me to a very knowledgeable man in Singapore, Alex Lin, who's agreed to be on the podcast later. And Alex took me to school about how far the Chinese had really come in terms of Qigong from the time that I had been there. And this is something I think that Phil suspected all along, and it gets us back to that original lecture that Shu gave, saying that humans are sensing background radiation from the Big Bang. There's this, in other words, there's this energy that you can't account for in physics other than to say it's background noise. So Alex introduced me to the concept of torsion energy, which is a property of matter that derives from electrons spinning and having their own spin, electrons spinning around nuclei, nuclei spinning, atoms making molecules that are just conglobulations of spinning, and it just spins also all the way up to a substance, to an object. And then when you make it move and make it living and give it, a physiology with a pumping heart, producing its own organic energy, you have a very complex spin system inhabiting this universe that's filled with spin energy that we can't measure because it's unidirectional. So Alex introduced me to that. And so now, this is one of the things I presented to Lou's conference that Phil and I attended. I call it the Great Border Project Proposal, where, again, this is based on an experiment that's already been done to prove that a human body produces a torsion field that is distinguishable from all the torsion energy that's around a person. So I took it from a guy named Peng, I think was his name, the guy that came up with this experiment. And what he did was he just used it to show that you can generate a torsion field. And then what I came up with was like, what happens if you stick a person in the middle of this experiment? What differential would you see? And that is the future of where I think pulsatile is going, that the heart signal will end up being an indicator of, and I think eventually we can use AI to identify healthy, pathological, and all in between states of torsion fields that humans generate. And there may be ways to massage the torsion field to bring about health, which is essentially what Qigong does. If you've ever seen an external Qigong master go to work on someone, they have the person either sit or lie down, and the Qigong master will use their hands and project their energy into the person. You'll see that they'll start sculpting the person. And I learned this in the first two podcasts. My student John Dockin and I talked about how we did this when I first started, very naively, and we got sick from doing it. So there's definitely dragons out there. There be dragons, as the old medieval maps used to say. So all these new age healers that were out there doing things, claiming to be energetic workers, uh, should be put on notice. They don't really know what they're doing, and I think many of them have found to their detriment that they are damaging their own health. I think they all know that now. And actually, there have been books that have been published on this. They call it burnout. Energy workers was talk about being burned out and they have to quit and they have all these therapies that they use. Well, the Chinese have known about this for thousands of years. So, and they've worked it out way better than we have. And that's why I think one of the reasons why we need to listen to them and talk to them. So ultimately, um, so this is the first when Pulsatile first came out. This is the logo I came up with, and it's a rather garish, kind of colorful design. And I've since now decided to go with the cool dark and gold logo. And actually, Claude recommended this, so I got a hat tip to Claude here on that. And I had Claude play with it and make it more like what I wanted. What it kind of gets at the original DVD design, which was black and gold. So I like that we've come full circle. And just to, put a bow on the end of this podcast to bring it to an end before I have Mr. Midland make closing comments, I just want to go back to the previous podcast for one last laugh because the ultimate message of Pulsatile is that humans are like nuclear subs cruising around at great depths, secretly ready to go off at the slightest sign of a nuclear attack. So don't worry, we're protected. And the whole time, remember, they're going boop, 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 boop. You are pulsating, whether you know it or not. And with that, I will unshare and we'll get back to Mr. Midland. You have any closing comments, Phil?
Just that my own sense is that the next level of what we will face, we're in the digital phase right now, will be energy itself. And what the Chinese are and the East, individual, can the human manage his energy? So I'll leave it at that. But we really need to put a lot more effort to understand the East.
Well, I'm doing my part as best I can, and hopefully this
For
is
quite a while.
this is another uh, a step in that direction. Hopefully, this particular podcast. I want to thank you, Phil, for your time. I know your time
Thank
is
you.
valuable. I really appreciate it, and thank you for all your years of support. And with that, I will bring an end to it and cue the music.